Dr. Chireau, starting off, I appreciate you for your time. Being able to scroll and do some research, and I was able to come across you about hoodoo, and I was blown away. So, seeing you speak at Harvard, that conversation, I love that. But starting off, we can keep it very basic for our first framing question. What exactly is hoodoo?
Oh, wow. Just jump right into it.
Yes,
Um,
ma'am.
it's a good question, but think about who is answering the question. So I am a historian. I
Mm-hmm.
study religions. So I have a very particular framework that I study hoodoo.
Right.
If you ask a practitioner what it is, they're going to tell you something. If you asked
Mhm.
a Christian what it is, they're going to tell you. So
Right.
my definition comes from my own work looking at religions comparatively. And what that basically means, comparative means I look at African American religions, but I look at the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
You're Christian or Muslim or Ifa, or
Mm-hmm.
that's how I frame it. So hoodoo, as I understand it, is a spiritual tradition.
Yes,
It
ma'am.
is an ancestral tradition, meaning that it draws upon the past, like many religions do.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also, and this is the controversial thing, I insist that it is a magical tradition, that it is
Mm,
magic or black, not black in the bad way, but
right.
it's racial and religious. That is African derived, but it originates in what later became the United States in America. So African American magic, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I'll just add this: practice and
Mm,
thought and action.
mm,
Sometimes when people talk about spiritual things or religious things, they separate those. They say, well, I believe
right.
this. Well, there's also a practice
Mm,
and a fit. So those two things together.
yes, ma'am. Hoodoo, right? It is this very vast subject, right, of learning, right? It's this like never ending thing. You can always find out more information. What got you involved in this space?
Okay. So yeah, as I said, I went to graduate school to study religion and really interested in, American religion because that's at the time that's what they taught. But finding that there really wasn't a lot written about Black Americans.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually not there's it's gotten better, but I was in school almost 40 years ago. So as I began to write and study, I thought what one thing I found is that a lot of the research that's been done on Black people and religion in this country has to
Mm-hmm.
do with the Black churches. All
Mm,
right. Black Protestantism,
right.
sometimes Black Catholics, but really
Yeah.
Black Christianity. And I said, oh, that can't be right because I know historically that even when we were enslaved, there was a lot going on, including
Mm-hmm.
Christianity in different periods. So when I got into hoodoo, trying to fill that gap, what other things were people, our enslaved ancestors, doing in terms of religion and spirituality? And
Mm-hmm.
it was a really hard question to answer because, as you can imagine, it's not like there's sources where they're telling us. So,
Exactly.
I really had to dig in. And that's how I discovered this thing that people later call hoodoo. They may or may not have called it hoodoo back then.
Yes, ma'am. Enslavement, right? To your point, what was going on when it comes to our people practicing hoodoo while being enslaved?
Yeah. So to answer that, what I found is that I had to go back before enslavement
Hmm.
because our story, of course, doesn't start here. It
Exactly.
starts in Africa,
Yes, ma'am.
originally.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to, you really have to understand something about Africa, and of course, it at that time, and I'm really looking at the 1800s and the 1700s, right? There's no Africa. There's
Mm,
there's Coromantee, there's
mm,
Yoruba, there's
mm,
Dahomey, but there's no Africa. So that's the first question. Is there something that we can go and look at Africa and
mm,
say, oh, they have religions and
mm.
that's tricky because all of the sources are being written by Europeans or people who aren't from that, who are imposing their
That's right.
identity. and this is really interesting, Caleb, even this idea of religion. So if I asked you,
Mm,
do African people have a notion of religion?
mm,
No, it's a
no,
non-existent, it's actually a Western concept
sure.
invented by Christians in order
Mm,
to delineate the world. Okay, so and that's sort of a simplistic way of putting it. Yeah. So for the European, Africans had witchcraft, they had
mm,
sorcery, they
mm-hmm.
had, I mean, I'm like, oh, that's cool. Well, it's not. It's anything but religion. So, even the categories that I had to work with, and most of the people who study this, they're really a problem. But to start the story of Black America, you have to look at Africa. And that's where things break down because so many of us have lost that link
Yeah.
to our ancestors. And to me, that's actually it's one of the traumas that the
Mm,
Middle Passage brought us, that all people have ancestors,
mm-hmm.
all people venerate. They don't worship ancestors, but they have ancestors that they can look to. So that was also very hard for me. Okay, so I now we can take one of those what are those tests, those gene
Yep.
tests,
Yep. Yep.
but even there,
Mm,
not being able to find your tribe,
that's
your
right.
family name. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so just the story starts there, and then it starts to get more difficult when we look at the Middle Passage. Someone said to me recently, and I think that this is really interesting and profound, Hoodoo begins on those ships. Okay,
Mm,
because people are coming from different places, they're speaking different languages.
mm-hmm.
How are they communicating? What
Right.
God are they calling on? Are they
Mm-hmm.
calling on the white man God? Who,
Mm,
are they calling on their own? Are they saying this is so the idea is that hoodoo is a response, a spiritual response to that terrible Middle Passage, which in a way is a birth that brings about the new world, but it's
mm-hmm.
also this incredible trauma. Religions, if you think of Christianity or any religion, really, they're born of often of violence and trauma. Even in
Mm-hmm.
indigenous African religions, there's an aspect of violence there, and I can talk about that specifically. So for me, it starts on those ships.
Mm,
It is a sort of a framing sensibility that drew out of many.
mm-hmm.
You have these one people, and of course, they're not Americans. They're not Black people didn't become American until
Mm.
actually until the 1900s when citizenship is decided. So
Wow.
so hoodoo is like a glue. It's like
Mm-hmm.
a spiritual glue. If and people aren't even conscious of it. So slavery, Middle Passage, Africa, you have to really, I think, trace it back to those sources to get to it. And so already I've talked about three things that you could spend your life studying,
Mm,
all right, and try to make sense of it. And then the other thing I will just say, and this is the problem I have today, people say, well, yeah, slavery, I know about slavery. Well, how long does slavery last? So is hoodoo in the late 1600s the same as it is in the 1800s at emancipation?
mm,
Things are always changing and evolving. So that became an even more difficult thing. Well, what are they doing in 1700 with hoodoo, or this thing that became hoodoo that's different the closer we get to emancipation and the afterlife of slavery? So that's in
mm.
essence what I wrote a very small book about. And if I wrote it today, it would be a lot bigger. I would probably answer more questions, but I take
Mm-hmm.
it from slavery right to the end of slavery to the 20th century.
Yes, ma'am. I love that. And resistance, right? That's a very big thing when it comes to hoodoo, right? What is the overall correlation between hoodoo and our resistance as a people? You know, the stories about Frederick Douglass, him practicing hoodoo for that moment in time. But what is the overall correlation with resistance in hoodoo for our people?
Yeah. So that's why I say, and when I teach this stuff, I say, if you're going to look at religion, you really need two frames: Africa and slavery. Africa
Hmm.
and slavery. You always have to look at those. So when we look at Africa as the source of what came later, you know, we find this sense of resistance.
Mm,
That's not necessarily what indigenous African religions were about. They're
mm-hmm,
about well-being, they're about empowerment, they're about connection, they're about relationship. So I say, well, yeah, that probably carried over. When we get to slavery, though, because slavery is like coloring everything, we say, well, yeah,
mm,
it has to be about resistance. It's really about both,
mm,
right? Hoodoo is about well-being, living a life of well-being. It's also about resisting those things that would thwart that. And that could be slavery.
mm,
It could be that person out there that's trying to get you,
mm-hmm.
whether
Yeah.
or not when you're a slave. It could be, and so that's
Mm,
why hoodoo has this element of protection in it. It doesn't matter whether it's the slave master who's trying to hurt you, all right? Or even though that's where we get some of these stories, it could be the man that's beating the black man that's beating his wife, and they're both enslaved. I'll just say that resistance is a part of it, but there's another part of it that I think that comes from the African element that has to do with living a life that is a good life,
mm-hmm,
that is a life of well-being too.
mm-hmm,
But yeah, resistance is where we get a lot of the stories about, that sort of counteract that idea that Black folk didn't do nothing to
mm,
obtain their freedom. All right. So in
mm-hmm,
my book, one of the very first documents that I found, and I really love to talk about this because I don't think anyone else has talked about this, is about a conjurer. He was African. And so this must have been the 1700s in Georgia. And what it is an advertisement for a runaway. All right. Back
mm,
then, Black people were running all the time. That's how they resisted and took their freedom. But it's an ad that says that this was an African, because when you made these ads, you had to identify them, the scars,
mm,
what they were wearing, because they would try to track them down. And it says that he was an African. They don't call him a witch doctor. They call him an African doctor.
mm,
And it goes on to say that he conjured and healed people. All right. His name was Long Hercules. They used to
mm,
give these bogus names. Okay.
mm-hmm,
They said that he speaks the African language. Again, the document, because it's a slave runaway advertisement, has to be really detailed. And it says that he is known, it was in Georgia, for miracles.
mm.
So this document, which is a terrible thing, right? This man is, and it also says that he leaves a wife and a child
Wow.
uh, to run away. So think about that. Just think about
Mm,
that for a second.
wow.
All right. He's resisting slavery in the way that so many of them did. They didn't take up arms. They said, let me get out of here. All
Mm,
right. We don't know what became of him. But it also said that he's a conjurer,
mm,
he's African, he's a healer. All
mm,
right. And there was a little bit of disparaging things in there. So that to me, that's the whole bundle right there. Hoodoo, and I call it hoodoo and conjure because that was the word that the English used, is about healing, all right? But it's also about harming. And I talk a lot about how healing and harming go together. And that's where it makes people nervous because religious folk aren't accustomed to thinking about harming. And when I say
mm,
harming, it's all the stuff that we think of when we think about resistance, all right?
mm,
Whether it's using belief in order to create a poison, all
mm,
right? Which is part of healing. Healers
mm.
also
That's
were
true.
master poisoners.
Mm.
Um, it's the healing and the harming go together. And I
So,
emphasize that, but people seem to love to hear about the harming. I think because they have a sense that resistance is about, using your power as a form of force. In some ways, the resistance may come in you making that choice that you are going to leave your loved one and your child behind and seek freedom. Okay.
mm-hmm,
All right. And there's so many stories like that, but we don't find them interesting or exciting enough because and granted, we want to sort of go against that narrative that
mm-hmm,
I still hear that black people were waiting for white people to free them.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
I hear that and I'm like,
mm,
and I don't think anyone believes it. but it's the sense that, oh, Black people did nothing to resist
Mm-hmm.
enslavement, and that is something that I didn't make up. There's a lot of scholarship that talks about the ways that what they call everyday resistance. And I would say that Hoodoo supported everyday resistance. You mentioned Frederick Douglass. There's
Mm-hmm.
that famous story that comes up again and again and again of Frederick Douglass when he was a young man in Maryland
Mm-hmm.
running away. And then he's a teenager and he's not going to make it. He's not
Mm-hmm.
going to make it. And he writes about this later. And he meets a root worker, a conjureman, an African conjureman in the woods. And that's the man who gives him the power root, High John the
Mm-hmm.
Conqueror. And he tells us this story, and Douglas is older when he tells the story, when he's a kid. And he says, I can't run away. I can't do it. And he takes the root from the African. Douglas hated Christianity. He hated
Mm-hmm.
religion. He was a rational, he was in brilliant. He takes the root from Sandy, the conjureman, and he goes back. And then the next day, the slave owner guy comes to kill him. He's so angry at him. And he says, this is the first time that the slave becomes a man. And it's such a
Mm-hmm.
powerful moment. I recommend his autobiography to everyone because for him, manhood was, I'm going to fight back, even if you're going to kill me. But then he remembers that he has this root. And it's so interesting because the root, high John roots, they look like phallus. They look like
Mm-hmm.
the manhood. They look,
Mm-hmm.
and he says, I remember the root. And for the first time, I fought back. And he says, now you see a slave becomes a man. And he kicked his ass. He
Mm-hmm.
kicked
Wow.
a white slave one. So we have these stories. We don't have enough of them from that period. That one's from the 1800s. But we have these stories of resistance. The other famous story, of course, is the story of Denmark Vesey,
Mm-hmm.
which I find so fascinating on
Yeah.
so many levels. So for your listeners, Denmark Vesey was an African.
Mm-hmm.
He was an African born, but he was of African descent in South Carolina in the early 1800s. And South Carolina had a very large enslaved population as well
Yep.
as a free Black population, and VC was free. They also had a thriving Christian church. And
Mm-hmm.
this is important because people who and I don't know, I'm not making any assumptions. People don't want to know about the Christians. They don't want to know about the Black
Mm-hmm.
church. It's really important story. And the churches are really important to our story.
Mm-hmm.
South Carolina had a thriving African church, Methodist churches called AME.
Yep.
One of the first Black church, AME church is about 20 minutes from here in Philadelphia.
Yep.
And so active community. The other thing about South Carolina and the Low Country that's really fascinating for us, and at that time, Black people outnumber white people. So,
Mm-hmm.
so, so when the colony of South Carolina was created, they brought so many Black people into that port of Charleston that to work the Low Country plantations, right? That they were like 2 to 1. So
Mm.
you think about that, you're like, how could it be that there were more Black people and a lot of Africans because they're flowing into that port than white people? So that's the scenario. So just quick story, because I don't want to. VC is a member of this church made
Mm-hmm.
up of free Black people, enslaved Black people, and the AME church at the time. This was the church for Black. This was the church where people created their own economic institutions. Very, very
Mm-hmm.
powerful. Um, and it is said that he planned a conspiracy
Mm-hmm.
in that church because as a Christian, he read the Bible through the lens of Black liberation theology, something else we don't talk too much about.
Mm-hmm.
So in planning a conspiracy, he was going to take the armory, he was going to hijack a ship and sail to Haiti. There all kinds of stories came out after the conspiracy, and we're not even sure if a lot of it is true. But one of the things that he did was he had a contingent of Africans who were going to be part of the soldiers. And the head of the contingent of Africans was named Gullah Jack.
Mm.
And we know the name Gullah refers to the African ancestors from, it's not clear whether they're from Angola or from, it's just not clear where they're from. But anyway, he was going to have Gullah Jack lead a contingent of warriors. And
Wow.
Gullah Jack, one of the first things he says is, I carry a charm
Mm,
and no white person can harm me. And
mm,
he had it said, again, this is all coming through white people, all
mm-hmm,
right, and some of it's coming under torture.
mm,
I have these potions. I have these not spells, of course. These artifacts that if you take them, okay, we will not die. So
mm,
he's lending the spirit of hoodoo to this resistance conspiracy, which, as we know, was, someone leaked it before it actually happened. And then everyone was caught before it had a chance to go. It was terrible. After that, it was actually very terrible, as it was after every slave rebellion after Nat Turner. They shut the
mm-hmm,
church down. People had
mm,
to leave. It was actually more repressive. And that
mm,
and that we see that pattern. We see that
mm-hmm,
pattern is we see it even today, right?
mm-hmm.
When Black people strike out
Yep.
violently, even for their
Mm-hmm.
freedom. Boy, my students call it the white lash.
Mm.
I'm
Wow.
laughing because it's just so, but it's
Yes.
a backlash to that push for freedom. But even in the conspiracy, hoodoo and conjure is part of it. Now someone here will say, well, yeah, it failed. How was that? Well, I'm not going to say that it failed,
Mm,
because as people heard about that, all right, and this actually started with Nat Turner, and Nat Turner
mm-hmm,
was a Baptist, he was a
mm-hmm,
Christian. As more and more people heard about it, the possibilities of violent, I'll call it insurrection against
mm-hmm,
slavery, was always there. So this was, how long after Nat Turner was this, was the Denmark VC? Maybe 20 something years, right?
wow.
Um, uh, the possibility that these enslaved people were going to, rise up, always there, and that their rising up could have some religious overtones. Now, I'll just add this little piece in, and I'm hoping that this isn't boring.
No, it's not boring at all. This is
An
captivating.
event happens,
Mm,
uh, even before Nat Turner, even before VC, that
mm-hmm,
shook uh, these people to the core, the slave regime to the core, and that, of course, is the Haitian Revolution.
mm-hmm.
From Haiti, we begin to get stories of this spooky religion. They
Right.
called it everything: satanic,
Mm,
demonic,
mm,
witchcraft, you
yep.
name it. But we know it to be the religion of the rebels, which,
Mm-hmm,
the white people called it voodoo.
yep.
Okay, they just took all kinds of names. The Black people, they probably didn't call it anything. Later, it becomes associated with Haitian Vodou. That is where these practices, these African derived practices, are associated with a kind of violence.
Mm,
Okay. Whether it's, you know, uh, Douglas getting that root and striking back, whether it's uh, Denmark VC and Gullah Jack striking back, whether it's these Africans striking
mm-hmm,
back against the racist slave regime. Voodoo and hoodoo become associated with a kind of violence
mm,
that had to be put down. Now, I would, and this is, I often push back against that, because I'm like, look, our great grandmothers were using hoodoo to heal and cure, or they would use it when they're birthing the babies. Where is the
mm,
violence in that?
mm,
So what I begin to see is that this is one of the ways that historians and just white Americans begin to characterize these practices that weren't quite Christian,
mm,
weren't quite, they're African, as, something that's really dangerous, and they had to be put down. So the story of voodoo it goes in a different direction. But I can tell you, most of your audience, when they hear that word, they have certain things that come to mind. And it's not just New Orleans. They think,
mm,
oh, voodoo, that's what the bad stuff. So
mm.
I'm like, fine, you can, whatever. But hoodoo, I would like to see that sort of looked at more critically. Hoodoo is not about doing bad stuff.
Mm.
You can, but that's not at the heart of it. And that's really what I try to emphasize again and again and again. But we're in an age where people gravitate toward scary stuff or horror
Yes.
or whatever.
Yes.
And that's fine. I understand that, we're clearing a lot of it now, but
Hmm.
there's so much more to what hoodoo was and is than doing things, bad things.
Yes. Yes, for sure. Dr. Chireau, to your point, when it comes to voodoo, they can be like sensationalized, right? When we got shows like American Horror Story, Angela Bassett's character, when they try to make it spooky. And as well, here in the South, it's the Bible Belt. And anytime that you would mention hoodoo, voodoo, certain Black people can get spooked out by it, right? How can we somewhat demystify and deconstruct everybody's preconceived notions, especially Black people that we've been taught about hoodoo and voodoo?
Yeah, that's a life's work, isn't it?
Mm,
Because when people, and I'm not saying that terrible things have not been done in the name of religion,
mm-hmm.
whether it's hoodoo, voodoo, or Christianity. I'm not saying that. But people seem to forget that. And it's often Christian people, you say the Bible Belt, who are saying, the curses that are done in the name of Christianity and all kinds of violence. But we
Yeah.
overlook that because for different reasons. I would say the first thing for me when I talk about this is separate out the voodoo piece because it's very clear that in this culture, at least, the notion of voodoo has been sensationalized and
Mm,
commodified. It's
mm-hmm.
what they call a trope. It's a
Mm-hmm.
kind of metaphor to talk about spooky things. And
Mm,
I'm actually I'm writing about this right now because particularly in popular culture, like Hollywood,
yep.
I'm looking at everything from comic books to advertisements to movies in the 20th century, voodoo becomes a way of speaking about the dangerous Black
Mm,
supernatural. So
yep.
separate that from hoodoo. All
Mm,
right, that's the first thing I would say, because that's not what we're talking about. And then look at what hoodoo was
mm,
in that slavery period.
for
So,
sure.
and one thing I talk about in my book is that during slavery, we assume that folks were all Christians, which they weren't, because not all Americans were Christians.
Mm,
There's, until that revolution, there's a lot of stuff that goes along with the church and the state. Fine, boring stuff. But I would say, what do you think that your ancestors, and I ask this to Black people, and Black people are starting to turn to their ancestors very slowly.
mm-hmm.
I'll say, what kind of religious world do you think they lived in? They
Mm,
probably weren't Christian. They might have been Muslim because there were
mm-hmm.
Muslims who come over from Africa. They might have had no religion, although I think that's unlikely.
Right.
What is the possibility that there is a religion or a spirituality that we can call hoodoo? It is the religion of the praise house, the
Mm,
religion of the hush arbor. It is the
mm,
old time religion where people would walk in a circle in a ring.
mm,
That ring shout had nothing to do with Christianity. And in fact, the Christians sort of appropriated it after emancipation. It is the religion of our enslaved ancestors crying together to God,
mm,
because I do believe that hoodoo and conjure, there is a God in that tradition. So I would say, to separate the voodoo stuff and try to think of the world in which your great, 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 great grandparents lived in. They might have just gone, to sit, yeah, maybe they weren't religious people, but to
mm,
hear the community and to have that fellowship. That's hoodoo.
mm,
That's hoodoo. And so today, practitioners of hoodoo are very clear. We treat this as an ancestral remembrance.
mhm,
So I get asked all the time, all once a week, I'm white, can I practice hoodoo? I'm
mm,
white, can I sell some hoodoo stuff? You can do whatever you want, all right? But if you do not have African ancestors, you cannot tap into the spirit and the legacy
Mm,
of,
mm-hmm,
that
mm.
t-shirt that says we are our ancestors' wildest
Water
dream.
streams. Yes, ma'am.
That belongs to us as Black
Mm,
Americans, right? White
mm,
people have ancestors too. That's the
mm.
great thing. Their ancestors might come from, what is this? The Scotland,
Yep.
Celtic,
Scotland,
or
Ireland.
England, all right, or
Yeah.
Ireland,
Yeah.
right? Where there's plenty of magic, but
Mm-hmm.
African ancestors.
Mm,
That's where I believe that the hoodoo spirit, if you want to call it that, is. And
mm-hmm.
I'm not saying, although my friends would say that means we need to venerate ancestors. I think that's a big part of it. But I tell everyone, Christians venerate ancestors.
Mm,
Mormons venerate. Okay, so some of my Bible friends say, well, Mormons and Catholics aren't Christians. Fine. But even in the Bible, it says,
mm.
it has it even lists them, begat, begat,
Yep.
begat, begat.
Yep.
So only us,
Mm,
only us, we are kept from this. And as more people turn to their ancestors, and I'm not saying full blown ancestor worship, whatever that is, I'm saying as a form of remembrance. I think it will really help people come to terms with, oh, well, maybe what they called hoodoo wasn't so bad. And it
mm-hmm.
wasn't about all this scary stuff trying to do things to other people, blah, 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 blah. All
Mm-hmm.
right. So I'm letting a lot of folk off the hook because what people want to know mostly, I get two calls from people. Oh, I'm white. Can I practice hoodoo? And I'm like, you can do whatever you want, but
Mm,
it's for those with African ancestors. I'm not
mm,
going to tell you who to worship, and I would
mm,
never do that at all. But the other thing I get calls about is, oh, I have this problem. Can you
mm,
help me find a way to get a trick? And I'm like, well, first of all, I'm not a professional. I'm a
mm,
historian. But
mm-hmm.
secondly, what is going on in your world that you need, protection, or you need to get even. So, today it's a wonderful moment that we have medicine, we
Mm-hmm.
have churches, we have hoodoo, we have all these things to help us to become whole people.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder what is going on in the world today that people feel that they must do violence in order to be free. I think because
Mm,
we see so much violence around us.
for
Um,
sure.
and Hoodoo's instructive there too. It's like you could do
Mm,
violence, you could do this.
mm-hmm.
That's one of the other things that I talk about in the book too. In this tradition, there's no good and evil. Like there's no devil for one thing.
Mm,
There's no like line between good and evil. It's
mm-hmm.
sort of again this African notion that good and evil are sort of shades of each other. So what might be good in one moment it might not be good in the other, and what might be evil in one moment. I'll just give you an example. During slavery, um, you're a Christian, you do become a Christian, you're a Black person, you're enslaved, and there were many
Mm-hmm.
Black people who did become Christian, not all of them.
Mm-hmm.
Is it a sin for you to steal from your master?
That's a good question.
They're
Ah,
actually asking that. And some of
mm,
them said yes, because
of
the
course.
Bible says, and
Right.
then others are like, does that mean that I cannot run away and take my freedom? So
Hmm.
the ethics during
Yep.
slavery of what's
Wow.
good and evil are
Yeah.
flipped. All right.
Mm,
And hearing that today, it sounds sort of like an excuse. Oh, but
mm,
it's not. I mean, it really shaped everything for a long time. So, I tell that to Christians, and they sort of get it. But and it's fine. It's fine. I think people are coming around. The thing that I'd like to see most, though, there's a lot of infighting, and
mm-hmm.
I know that as a people, we have our inside things.
For
We
sure.
have our thing. But it's one thing that I really want my religious folk to get right. And it's not just Christians. I talk to practitioners of Ifa, or,
Mm-hmm.
that there is something, whether you are Muslim, whether you're Christian, whether you're Ifa, whether you're even, a free thinker, there is something that all of us share in terms of spirituality and outlook.
Mm-hmm.
That is not an academic statement. I could
Mm,
not prove it. But it's this idea that Black people share something W.E.B. Du Bois called it the gift of Black folk. And he
Mm,
framed it in terms of religion. All right. What is it that we all share, whether we are Hoodoo
mm-hmm.
or Christian, or, I wrote my second book on Black Jews, right?
Yes, ma'am.
What is it that we all have? And once you get people to sit down and start to think about that,
Mm,
that's when you have these conversations. But before that, everyone's kind of just holding space for their own thing, which is fine. That's sort of mature. But there is a point where we have to look at ourselves as Black people.
mm,
I think,
yes.
right now that's the debate, right? Are you American?
Yep.
Are you Black? Are you
Yes.
African? I don't know.
Mm,
Yeah,
that is excellent. Yes, no, that's excellent, Dr. Chireau. And ancestral worship on that standpoint, right? Like what you said, that's all throughout the Bible. They tell you this person came from this person. In
yeah,
the book of Matthew, I think chapter 1, verse 1 tells you about Jesus' entire genealogy, who he comes from,
exactly,
right? Hearing
exactly.
you talk about ancestral worship and that being basically like a foundation for us healing as a people, why
Yeah.
is that so important for us to honor the people who came before us?
Well, and again, ancestor worship, the term worship is a phrase that anthropologists kind of threw on it when they saw Africans building shrines
Mm,
or altars or spaces for venerating.
mm-hmm,
I'm not going to worship my great grandmother. She was a badass. I'm not going to
mm-hmm,
worship God.
mm,
God alone gets worship, but I
for sure.
respect her and I elevate and venerate her.
Hmm.
This is important because, as you said, it's biblical. All right.
Yes.
And
Yes.
so those chapters that we skipped over, that so and so begat, 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 begat,
Mm,
that is a way of calling their names into the present. All right. And this is something that I've seen in African American ritual and African
mm-hmm,
ritual. I've seen Chinese people do it. I've seen Mormons do it. You
mm-hmm,
speak the name of those who are dead. All right, so that they can live. Maybe it's literal living, maybe it's not. So putting aside worship, because I think that's like a stumbling block for people. Oh, only God deserves worship. Yes,
mm,
only God deserves our worship, right?
mm-hmm,
But our love
mm,
and our veneration and our respect for what our ancestors went through
right.
to get your ass here today.
Mm,
That's something that I think that African Americans must recover. All
mm-hmm,
right. Oh, Professor Chireau, the Bible says they're sleeping. The Bible says they'll be judged, and blah, blah, blah. Yes, yes, all of that is true. But what is your relationship to those people? Even more so, because that chain was broken by the middle passage. Who's going to heal it? Who's going
mm,
to heal it if you don't do it for your own? Now, I can't recall. And some people can actually go back and find their genealogies in Africa, but I can't. So many of us can't. All right, so we have to kind of like sort of call the name or the spirit or
mm,
in traditions. That is so important in order to
mm-hmm,
heal that
mm-hmm,
relationship. So I do understand the reservations that people have with ancestor veneration.
mm-hmm,
But you don't even have to think about it like that. You can think about it as a way of respecting
mm,
those people that whether or not they were conscious of it. And sometimes I do a meditation where I just try to think about what it was like for them
mm.
to choose to survive. Um,
Yes, ma'am.
I think Toni Morrison writes about this, right? Uh, that these people chose to survive
Mm,
because we know, of course, and I mentioned the middle passage, a lot of them said, I'm going back home, and
mm,
they would throw themselves into the sea, right?
yeah.
Or they would, the stories of the legends of the Africans who walked on the water and flew back. All right. They did not survive to bring a child here who would
Mm,
bring another child, and then you are the result of that. And
mm,
there's not a judgment of that, okay? But we are here because we're the culmination of
mm.
people who made choices
That's
to
right.
continue. Why wouldn't? And this is the thing that I don't get. People are like, oh, I don't ancestors and the dead. When they call upon the founding fathers in
Mm,
this, who are they calling
yes.
upon? They call upon dead people. They are naming them. They are
Mm,
venerating him so that the
mm.
nation,
Wow.
they know what they're doing.
Wow.
But so I laugh about this a lot, but
Yes.
I somehow sometimes don't understand the resistance to this. Only maybe because they think it's worship, and it's not at all. I wouldn't worship any of my family members, actually.
Mm.
It's that remembrance.
Hmm.
So that you can be like, wow,
Yes.
I am your wildest dream. And I love that saying. I don't know who came, do you know who came up with that saying?
I have no
That
idea either, but I love that as well.
I love it. I
Yes.
love it. I love it. And that
Yes.
gets you into the spirit. It's
It
not
does.
about worship. People always ask, oh, hoodoo altars and this and that. There are Christians who have altar spaces
Mm,
with pictures of their ancestors. That's ancestral elevation right there. Okay, we won't call it that.
mm,
We won't
hmm.
call it that. So that, and I think we're seeing more and more of that. There's more of an acceptance of that. Certainly, since I started doing this, people are talking about it more. And what's beautiful is that it crosses all of the religious traditions that Black folk are engaged in. You don't have to be a hoodoo. Although I will say that for hoodoo practitioners, that's the ground floor. Before
Hmm.
you do anything, you turn to your ancestors, because
Hmm.
that's going to empower whatever work or whatever hoodoo things that you're going to do. And that's what I tell the white people too. You can practice hoodoo, but you need to talk to your ancestors. Maybe they have something that they can give you. Um,
Hmm.
because and I get in a lot of trouble because young folk out there, they're like, white people, this is closed. It's not for you. White people go. And I get it, because
For
like
sure.
so many aspects of our culture that are beautiful and wholesome, someone
Hmm.
wants to come in and take a piece of it. And
As
that's actually,
usual. Yeah.
but yeah, Caleb, that started in the 1800s. All right.
Mm,
And by the time of the migration, I write about this, Black folk were moving, and the white people and the Black people said, we got to sell this thing. And
mm.
so you have what Katrina Hazard Donald calls, she calls it a marketed hoodoo. It's still
Wow.
hoodoo, but it doesn't have the same sort of power. It's the kind of
Yes.
hoodoo you can go into the stores and buy, or the shops,
Hmm.
and I actually find that hoodoo to be really interesting, because it's like a urban hoodoo versus the old time Southern hoodoo. And because so many people came into the cities at that time. But that's where the white folk were like, ooh, there's a lot going on there. So,
Wow.
and to be completely honest, I know a lot of practice white people who practice hoodoo, but it's certainly not what
Mm,
the enslaved people did.
mm.
There's different kinds of hoodoo. Even there's poor white Appalachian hoodoo,
Wow.
but I would argue that it all begins with the African people on that ship who
Hmm.
are looking for some sort of way to bridge the gap between. Oh,
Yep.
and one more thing that I also love, that the people, there were Christians on the slave ships, right?
Mm,
It's
yep.
like, oh, well, Christianity is an African religion,
That's
because
right.
this Christian church is in East Africa, right?
Yep.
But then they're finding that a lot of Africans, not that many Africans came to the United States, or what became
Hmm.
the United States, but many that did came from a region that is now called Congo, not
Yep.
the same as the DRC. Um, and that region was Christianized in the 1400s.
Yes.
So we have, and this is why I love to study this. We have Christians, we
Yep.
have Africans, we have Muslims, we have
Yeah.
Jews,
Yeah.
real diversity. If we could realize that,
Mm,
and instead of picking and taking these sides, that sort of the spirit that emerges from that, just that recognition that even
hmm.
under the worst conditions, we had this beautiful tapestry, this diversity, and
Mm,
we can talk to each other. To me, that's unlike any other group, because these white people were fighting over religious difference. Well, you're
hmm.
Catholic and
Yep.
you're Anglican, and
Yep.
I hate you, and you're the Puritans.
Yep.
They didn't have that choice, these enslaved people, because
Mm,
they had to somehow get along. All of that changes after emancipation, of course, and So that's the story I
Wow.
like to tell when I tell the
Yes.
story. And I think it's something that more Black folk need to hear. There aren't that many people who and there are some wonderful books.
Yes.
I try to write books that aren't so academic, that
Mm-hmm.
they're accessible. But it's kind of hard, because it seems to me that these are the days where people are sort of taking sides,
Yep.
and even in my family. And I got to
Mm.
tell you, Kayla, I love all people. I
Yes,
love
ma'am.
all religions. I am
Mm-hmm.
one of these love child people. But even in my family, I have Christians who are more fundamentalist about it,
Mm-hmm.
and they draw a line there. They
Right.
say, no magic, no
Mm.
voodoo, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus.
Yep.
Oh, I'm fine with all of that,
Mm-hmm.
but it's sort of my way or the highway, or they say it's
Mm-hmm.
God's way.
Mm.
But then what do you do with the Muslim who was sitting next to you on that slave ship? What do you do with the Ifa
Mm-hmm.
practitioner who is, trying to help you as you're in that stinking slip? Well,
Mm-hmm.
they just didn't know Jesus. It's actually there's a
Mm.
ridiculous argument, or so, and that's my frustration today. But I truly love everyone.
Yes.
I really do. I really do.
Listen, I understand. I understand. African, right? Judaism, that's something that you have done extensive research on. You wrote in your second book on, like what you said. And, when it comes to the Bible, sometimes I get so frustrated when people view it as like this white man's text. Me, however, it's like when you further read, I view it as like to me, an actual African text. I don't view it as just something that a white person wrote. Of course, we can talk about Jesus, him being described as Black in the Bible or King Solomon. I mean, all the way through, right?
Yeah.
And recently, right, it has gone viral of TD Jakes finally admitting in a sermon recently about the African legacy in the
Oh,
Bible. But if you
okay.
can, please, can we just expound upon that when it comes to Africa's legacy, when it comes to Judaism, and also when it comes to the Bible as well?
Yeah, well, the book that I actually edited with someone else
Mm-hmm.
was looking at how African Americans understood themselves in relation to not so much Judaism, but in relation to the Hebrews of the Bible.
Right.
Because
Exactly.
that's one thing most people don't realize,
Yep.
that the Bible, there's, at least the Hebrew scriptures, the Old
Mm-hmm.
Testament, there's no Jews really. There's
Mm-hmm.
Hebrews and there's Israelites.
Exactly. Yep.
So Black people take those stories and identify with it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, someone's sitting here saying, yeah, but that's not what really happened.
Mm.
But so much of our story as a people is mythic. And what I mean by that, myth is not something that's not true. It's
Mm-hmm.
something that is such a powerful tale that it
Mm.
becomes true. I tell my students this, whether or not you're Christian or not, is the story of a man rising from the dead after
Mm.
being nailed on a cross. Is it a true story or is it a myth? And my students look at me like this and
Wow.
think, and they're like, well, it's a myth, but it's true. And I'm like, exactly.
Mm.
For the Christian, it is mythical. It is the foundational tale. Or even, the stories of walking on the water, any miracle story. They're powerful stories. But to some extent, it don't matter whether they're real or not.
Mm.
I don't know whether those Africans flew back. All right. I don't know whether they were saying they flew back in their consciousness or they sprouted.
Mm.
That's the power of myth. So when Black people identified with the Israelites and the Hebrews, it was a mythic identification because they saw
Mm.
themselves as those slaves that were in Egypt. And that's where it gets kind of tricky, right? Because Egyptians, as we know, are Black people. So we're the Black Egyptians enslaving the African Israelites. It doesn't matter because it is a
Mm.
mythic sort of frame
Mm-hmm.
to understand the story and to identify so much with that it's
Mm.
true.
Mm.
We were slaves in
Mm.
in in that foreign land,
Mm-hmm.
in Israel. So that's what I'll say about
For sure.
Judaism. I get
Mm-hmm.
calls on that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a new book that came out that and it's actually it's gotten to be more controversial because people are claiming, well, they're Jews. And some
Mm-hmm.
people say, well, yeah, anyone can be a Jew.
Mm-hmm.
And I have Jewish friends. I have a rabbi friend who says anyone can
Mm-hmm.
be. And then
Mm-hmm.
others say, no, it's part of the bloodline.
Mm-hmm.
That's the mess for us to figure out. That's
Mm-hmm.
less interesting to me. I'm interested in what is that power of belief that makes you become that. That
Mm-hmm.
what is that thing that made Frederick Douglass fight back?
Yes, exactly.
What is the thing that gives you the impetus to run away? Or as Gullah Jack knew, to face, those people who were going to kill him and later did. What
Mm-hmm.
is that? So some would say, well, that's God, that's Jesus. I'm saying it's more than it's different than that. It could be
Yes.
God and Jesus and this other thing.
Mm.
So, but the Bible, you're right, there's so much more. And I wish that we gave our Black Bible scholars some love, more
Mm.
love, our Black theologians more love. They're in
Mm-hmm.
the trenches. It's good that story you told me about TD Jakes. I didn't know about it, but why does it
Mm-hmm.
take so long? I mean,
That's what I said too.
it's like
Yeah.
there's something happening right now where we're starting to recognize who we are, and I'm
Mm.
for it. But I wanted this back in the 20th century.
Understood.
Yeah, but we need to give our Black scholars of theology, and I'm not a theologian, the people
Mm-hmm.
who are engaged with the churches, more love and support, because they're the ones who are saying, okay, Jesus is Black, and this is
Mm.
what it is. All right.
Mm-hmm.
This is or the Bible is an African
Mm-hmm.
document, and
Mm-hmm.
this is what it means. Because I think that would actually enrich our
Mm.
Christianity. So
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. No, that is a great point. And the Book of Clarence, have you ever seen that film before?
No, my students told me about that. Yeah.
Excellent film. So when
Yeah.
it comes to myth, right? When it comes to resistance, all of those factors was exposed throughout that film, right? Of seeing an all black cast, seeing black Hebrews, right? Of course, and seeing them be oppressed. And it was just like the cops today, right?
Yeah.
Clarence's mother, seeing him crucified, felt like Mary, of course, and seeing our own black mothers, right? When you see a George Floyd,
Yeah.
Breonna Taylor, right? So from seeing that film, I think that ties into Frederick Douglass, did
Yeah.
Mark Vesey, right? Bella Jack, and I think so often we get this overall like misnomer of, hey, these people during slavery times are people who were so docile that they were being indoctrinated, all of that. However, from hearing you talk about the AME church, that they were true like revolutionaries and not just sitting aside, right?
Yeah.
For our generation, younger people, when we are taught about slavery, we just always think, uh-huh,
Alexa, stop. I have my alarm. I'm sorry. You might have to cut.
no,
I'm so Alexa, stop. I love this technology, but it's
yeah,
like it's annoying.
listen, I get it. It could be wonky.
No, there's one thing I actually, when I was coming to the office, I said I have to mention this to you, because it was on my mind. I'm looking for the Black Christ. I'm
Hmm.
looking for the Black Christ in the 20th century, because now we have Black Christ. We have, image, and people are starting to talk about, oh, Black Jesus was a Palestinian,
Right,
blah, blah,
right,
blah.
right, right.
But I'm looking for the Black Christ. And I grew up in the 20th century. I grew up in the
Mm-hmm.
1900s. You can't find the Black Christ.
Mm,
And there is a book that I would recommend to everyone to read. It is by one of our esteemed late Black theologians by the name of James Cone. And he was a Christian theologian. He was the first Christian theologian at Union Seminary. And it's called The Cross and the Lynching Tree.
mm,
And the book says that if we think of Christ, and he wrote a book a long time ago in the 60s that said, Jesus was a revolutionary, which he was.
mm,
Jesus was Black, and that's where the white people lost their minds in the 60s. He said, I may not even mean this literally, even though you
hmm.
can, but he is going against the system.
Right.
He is tortured for it. But his last book, which was really, really the profound part, if you think about lynching, all right. If you think about the Black body and how
Hmm.
it was tortured and broken, and maybe not hung up on the cross, but hung up, right?
Mm,
Does Christ come to mind? And in some ways, and so he goes into the history of lynching, which I don't think we talk about enough in this country, right?
mm,
And if Governor DeSantis has his way, we will never talk about lynching, all right? But how the lynching of innocent people is such a parallel with what happened with Jesus Christ. All right. And he in this book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, he maps it theologically onto the lynching. All
Wow.
right. And so what you have is a black man on
Mm.
the Black Christ. Now, I just even saying that, I know some people would
Mm.
lose their minds, but listen to it, what he's saying, that if we believe that a man took upon the sin, all
Wow.
right, and suffered in the most horrendous ways, and we know that Black people suffered, and we have so much documentation of lynching, right? And I actually think there's a museum now of how ritualized it was, how they would
Yep.
march people.
Yep.
Why wouldn't we conceive of Christ as a black man
Wow.
instead of
Yeah.
the golden? I'm working on your audience is going to find this really goofy, but
Mm.
everybody's going to want my book when it's written. I'm looking at comic books right now,
Mm.
and I'm looking at religious comic books or
Mm.
religion and comic books, and I explained more of that on my website. But all of the religious comic books that I'm finding from the 1900s, because that's the 20th century, Jesus has the blonde, and it's the blonde hair, and
Mm-hmm. Yep.
it is such an it's such a jarringly impossible vision. Whether
Mm.
or not he was black and he had
Mm.
the nappy hair, to see God as a blonde white man, as in such a conventional way, it's actually hard for me to see it. That
Wow.
this, and then you say, well, who did that?
Mm.
And so there's a couple of scholars who have a book called The Color of Christ. That's
Yep.
another good book for you. So
Yep.
so these two books, Crossing the Lynching Tree, The Color of Christ. And then like it's almost like magic that people
Mm.
actually see God
Mm.
blonde. First of all, it's impossible. Anyone, even little kids tell you that now, but
Mm.
this is what it was. So, but do we call that evil? To
Wow.
create the image of God as this white, blonde, So, so the comic book thing is I'm sort of tracing these images, not only of, Jesus, but any kind of religion, Black religion. So the religion that comes up, if you were to guess, and I don't know if you're a comic book fan, but I'm mainly looking at like the golden age. If you were to guess what most Black people are pictured doing in these comic books, and I'm talking about the superheroes and
Mm.
what religion do you think it would be? It's not Christianity.
Oh,
It's
it's
a
not Christianity.
it's a made up religion called voodoo. So,
Mm.
and I said, what? I'm reading these old comics from the 1930s and 40s. I keep saying voodoo. I'm like, what is
Wow.
it? What is it? So I'm like, I got to write about that. Because when people
Mm.
ask me, they're like, what do you write? I say comic books because they had such an influence, especially in the 1940s, on a whole generation's consciousness. And what they see and what they tell us is that Black people didn't have religion, or if they did, they're like, they're very minstrel and they're singing and
Mm-hmm.
they're dancing that. When they did have religion, though, they had this thing called voodoo, and it's
Mm.
and it's such an interesting, but it's like the white Jesus face.
Wow.
We just take it for granted that
Wow.
that's what Black people do. So
Mm.
when I say I'm looking at comics, I get the eye rolls, but I'll tell you, I'm the only one who's doing this, and
Mm.
it's not child's play, because
Mm.
it's in those images you can actually see the visceral fear of Black people, the hatred of Black people, and it's astounding. It's like, and so but when I think about the Black Christ, that's kind of where I go. It's like even little kids know that now.
Mm.
Where did they get the impunity to imagine God, the Son of God, as a white man?
Mm. Wow.
All right, so that and that kind of got me, and I'll just say that quickly because I have to go. When I decided to go to grad school, I have a book on my shelf back there. It's called The Religions of Man. And when I was a kid, I loved to read about cultures and religions. And there it is in a scholarly book. Jesus was a tanned white man, it says.
Mm. Wow.
Is it true? Is it myth? Is it possible? But that's
Mm.
what got me to say, that don't even sound right. So,
Mm.
and I said, I got to study this. And I didn't know that you could study religions like this, but my family really gave me the freedom to pursue whatever intellectual, whatever the life of the mind is. And I think I don't believe that Jesus was a tanned white man. That doesn't
Right.
even sound right.
At all. Not at all.
But that's the scholarly authority. So that's why I went to study religions, that there were some things that are truths, there are
Hmm.
some things that are interpretations of
Yeah.
truths. And I really wanted to tell the story of Black America
Hmm.
and the different truths, as well as the different myths that and that's why I did this. I had no idea you could do it for a living though.
Wow.
So
Doctor,
so I really enjoyed this. I really enjoyed talking with
yes.
you.
Dr. Shiro, I had such a great time with you. I know that you have to leave. So a very last question for you. You can answer this in a minute or less because I know
Mhm.
you have to leave. Aggressive magic. What is that? And how does that correlate with Jesus in the fig tree?
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, I used to say that was one of my favorite stories because yeah, the story is that Jesus is hungry. He's been
Hmm.
traveling. It's in the book of I'm not going to say Mark or Matthew. I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, and he the tree is not producing figs and he gets
Hmm.
hungry and he's like, oh, you, and he curses it and he says something that's very Jesus-y and
Right.
the thing dies. Oh boy, the Christians interpret that story in different ways. Well, he's
Right.
not cursing it. It's about the thing being out of season. Jesus would never curse anyone. If he was at least part human, he'd get pissed at people.
Mm.
So aggressive magic is something that can occur with religions too. It is a magic that in Hoodoo, at least, it is used mainly for self-defense. Okay,
Hmm.
someone's doing something bad to me, so I have to push back. And there's different forms of it. There's the kind of form where it's spiritual warfare,
Mm.
where you are literally, it's a life and death fight. There
Mm.
is the form of it in Hoodoo, with I mentioned the use of the leaf for
Hmm.
healing and for poisoning, that you
Hmm.
can use a leaf to bring bad luck to someone. That's a
Hmm.
kind of aggressive magic. Or someone would say it's negative.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't know if it's negative. If it's a slave owner that's doing this to you, is it negative? So where the problem is in talking about aggressive magic is some people draw the line and say, I will do no harm.
Mm.
Okay. I will do no harm. I will do unto others the way that I want to be. I do not want someone to do aggressive magic.
Mm.
But for Black people, again, coming out of slavery, we are in these impossible situations. We
Hmm.
are we are trapped.
Hmm.
Okay. Black women are being raped by their, slave masters, white slave masters. They are
Hmm.
enslaved.
Hmm.
Would it be a sin to kill this man? Would it be a sin to, so this it comes out of an impossible situation that people are I won't say forced because we
Hmm.
always have a choice, but they turn to use aggressive forms of magic. Oh Lord, I pray that that slave
Mm.
master, he breaks
Hmm.
his neck.
Hmm.
That's aggressive magic,
Mm.
right there, right?
Wow.
So to me, it's an interesting moral line. Some people say, nope, can't do it. And we did have a lot of enslaved people, and we have their testimonies that said, I will not do violence. I cannot choose violence, especially once I'm a Christian, right? And there
Hmm.
are others who say, I have got to live.
Mm.
And then there are others, they're like the Christ.
Mm.
All right. I give it to you, God. All right, including my body.
Hmm.
And that's it. So aggressive magic, I think, is a choice. Where we live in a violent world, and I tend to think today people turn to that solution because they think it's easy. They don't realize that it's a principle in magic. You talk about a white lash or a
Mm.
backlash. That is true. Any kind of aggression or any kind of force or movement
Hmm.
is going to come back in some way. So, some magicians will say, well, we don't work that path. And others will
Hmm.
say, there is a way to use that kind of magic. Christians do that. I don't like when they get, and that's why I told that story of Jesus and the fig tree. And they say, oh, we don't do Christians will curse someone, but they'll do it in a nice way.
Mm.
Oh God, take away I don't know. They'll say, at least we're saved and we're doing
Mm.
it.
Mm,
So I had been asked whether it's appropriate for Black people to use these forms of aggressive magic. That is not for me to answer. That
mhm,
is not for me to answer. I always reiterate that it is a choice. We are
mhm,
no longer in the impossible situation that our ancestors were in, where they could either die or they could run.
mhm.
All right. That's all they
Wow,
could do. They could either
wow.
say, I'm going to be a slave forever,
Mhm,
right? Or I'm going to run or fight back and he's going to kill me. We're no longer there.
mm.
And to me, that's huge. So, and I say that to young people, and they young people want to fight.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, you want to fight, talk to your ancestors first,
Mm.
and
Wow.
then come back. And that's why I think the ancestor thing is so important, you know.
Yes,
But
ma'am.
young folk don't listen.
Yes, ma'am. Dr. Chireau, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you. I know you are extremely busy. So when this episode, when it's done, I'll make sure to share this with you once it's live on YouTube. But thank you so much for your time, Dr. Chireau. I
Yeah,
appreciate you.
I really enjoy talking to you,
Yes,
and
ma'am.
hopefully we'll talk again. Okay.
Yes, ma'am. Most
Okay.
definitely. And you have a great weekend, all right?
Okay. You too.